Dear students, in this module we will study the policies that are influencing spatial distribution and urbanization. Specifically, we will look into the aspects related to spatial distribution, then urbanization, then rural urban migration, with focus on the response of the governments to address issues that are related to all these three aspects, namely spatial distribution, urbanization and rural urban migration. Let us now talk about the spatial distribution and the kind of response from the governments towards the spatial distribution. In 2013, only 10% of the governments were satisfied with the spatial distribution of population in their countries. Majority of the governments, 60%, desired a major change in spatial distribution of their population. Since mid-90s, a growing proportion of governments have considered spatial distribution of their population as unsatisfactory. That means, over a period of time, there has been considerable change in the perception and opinion of the governments with regard to the spatial distribution. Let us continue the discussion on views of the government on spatial distribution. The percentage of governments that viewed or considered spatial distribution of population in their countries as satisfactory declined from 29% in 1996 to 10% in 2013. That means, as on 2013, only 10% of the countries expressed that the spatial distribution in their country was satisfactory. So, there is reduction in the satisfaction levels of the governments in terms of the spatial distribution in their respective countries. The percentage of governments that were in favor of a major change in spatial distribution increased from 42% to 60%. That means, 60% of the governments in 2013 were desiring to have major change in the spatial distribution within their country. This again indicates growing concern about the kind of spatial distribution the countries were having. In 2013, greater proportion of the governments in less developed regions desired a major change in spatial distribution of the population compared to the more developed regions. In the case of less developed regions, 70% of the governments were in favor of major change in the spatial distribution within their country. On the other hand, only 29% of the countries or governments from the more developed regions felt so. That means, it clearly indicates the desire for changing the spatial distribution within the country was expressed more in case of the less developed regions compared to the more developed regions. This again depends on the kind of spatial distribution, the kind of issues related to land availability, the kind of infrastructure that is available in different areas, etc. One has to keep all these aspects in mind while making any inference about the policy response of the governments with regard to spatial distribution. The proportion of governments that desired to have a major change in spatial distribution of their population was particularly high among the least developed countries, with 80% of them desiring to have a major change. We have seen that in the more developed regions 29% of the governments were in favor of a change in the spatial distribution. In case of less developed regions 70% of the countries or governments were desiring to have a change in the spatial distribution. In case of the least developed countries 80% of the governments were desiring to have a major change. The least developed country governments were more in favor of a change or major change rather in the spatial distribution, followed by that of the less developed regions, with the more developed region governments being the lowest in terms of preference for a major change in the spatial distribution. Between 1996 and 2013, proportion of governments that viewed their spatial distribution as satisfactory declined in more developed regions as well as less developed regions. Proportion of governments desiring a major change in the spatial distribution of population ranged from none of the governments in the Northern America and 30% in Europe and 80% in Africa. That means desire to have a major change in the spatial distribution was very high in case of Africa. Now let us look at the spatial distribution and urbanization. Spatial distribution of population and urbanization are closely associated to developmental challenges and developmental opportunities. More than half of the world's population already resides in urban areas. This is because of the ever increasing levels of urbanization, mainly due to more and more migration from rural areas to urban areas. On the other hand, the remaining rural population is increasingly depending on the urban centers for social and economic progress. The dependence of rural population on urban areas is another issue that needs to be understood in the context of spatial distribution and urbanization. Now let us try to understand the kind of policies that are in place to improve the living conditions of the people irrespective of their residence. Policies to improve the living conditions of people in rural as well as urban areas, besides promoting sustainable urbanization, are quite relevant in the context of implementation of 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Besides, it is also important and relevant for new framework for urban development that was adopted during the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, Habitat 3, that was held in October 2016 in Ecuador. Now let us look at the urban growth projection. Proportion of population residing in urban areas is increasing across all the regions of the world, but such rate of urban population growth is substantially higher in Africa and Asia, where 85% of the global increase in urban population between 2015 and 2030 is projected to occur. That means Africa and Asia are expected to have a global increase in urban population of about 85% during 2015 and 2030. Let us now look at the urban agglomerations. During 2015 and 2030, number of urban agglomerations with population of 5 million or more is projected to increase from 73 to 104. The projections indicate that the number of 5 million plus cities or urban agglomerations would increase to 104 by 2030, and of additional 31 new urban agglomerations in this category, 26 will be in Africa and Asia. That means bulk of the growth in urban population as well as urban agglomerations, particularly that of 5 million plus population, is likely to happen in Africa and Asia. That means the urban challenges, the challenges relating to urban livelihood, urban health, urban sanitation, urban employment, urban transport, etc., need to be tackled by the governments from these two regions, namely Africa and Asia. Now, let us try to understand the policies relating to migration from rural to urban areas. Urbanization is a key factor that shapes the spatial distribution of population of a country or a region. In particular, migration from rural areas to urban areas has historically represented a crucial force boosting rapid growth of cities. In the recent years, more and more governments have seen the need to devise policies towards reducing the rural to urban migration. Among the 185 countries for which data is available as on 2013, 80% of the governments had policies to reduce rural to urban migration. This figure was 38% in 1996. That means, in 1996, 38% of the governments were having policies to lower the rural to urban migration, whereas in 2013, 80% of the governments had such policies. That means, in 2013, 4 out of 5 governments had policies to address the rural urban migration with an intention to bring down the level of rural to urban migration. Proportion of governments with policies to retain people in rural areas varies by level of development and by geographic region. In 2013, proportion of governments that had policies to reduce rural to urban migration was higher in the less developed regions, with a figure of 84% compared to the figure of 67% in case of more developed regions. The proportion of governments with policies to reduce rural to urban migration was higher in case of the least developed countries. The policies to reduce rural to urban migration were particularly more common in the Oceania, with 86% of the countries resorting to that kind of measures towards lowering the rural to urban migration. Africa and Asia, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean and Europe. Between 1996 and 2013, proportion of governments with policies to lower rural to urban migration increased in both more developed regions as well as less developed regions. In fact, across all the regions of the world, there has been increase in proportion of governments with policies to reduce rural to urban migration between 1996 and 2013. The governments in the less developed regions were more likely than the governments in the more developed regions to have adopted policies or strategies in the past 5 years to influence spatial distribution of the population in their countries. Now, let us continue the discussion about the policies in response to rural urban migration and spatial distribution. In the recent years, countries that experienced higher urban growth rates, which are mostly in the lower income groups, these countries were more likely to have policies to reduce migration from rural areas to urban areas. We all know the increase in levels of urbanization. In response to the reality of increasing levels of urbanization, because urbanization seems to be the reality. Some people also consider urbanization as inevitable, because the people see more and more opportunities for economic progress and livelihood and educational attainment in the urban areas. In the process, the people move from rural areas to urban areas. That kind of migration leads to urbanization. So, in response to the urbanization levels that are increasing in their respective countries, measures to promote rural development were adopted by majority of the governments across the regions. The policies to develop rural infrastructure and facilities was observed almost on universal basis across the regions, across the countries. The policies were there in place towards developing rural infrastructure and rural facilities. High income countries where per capita CO2 emissions tend to be higher were also more likely to have adopted policy measures to increase energy efficiency in transport and housing sectors in the recent years. Many middle income countries, but very few low income countries adopted such policy measures. The kind of transport systems developed in many of the developed countries and some of the developing countries as well gives evidence to this. The metro rail initiative from the government of India in many cities like Delhi, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, etc. is a measure in this direction. Because of the alarming levels of air pollution, traffic jams and problems related to urban transport faced by the people, the governments in less developed regions were more likely to have adopted policies to improve access to water and sanitation, and also to secure land tenure and adequate housing for the urban poor, compared to the governments in more developed regions. Because in the more developed regions, access to such services, basic services such as water, sanitation, etc. was already widespread in the more developed regions. The necessity was not felt. The needs were already taken care of by the governments in more developed regions. Whereas, in case of less developed regions, the needs are unmet in terms of water, sanitation, health, transport, etc. in the urban areas. So, the governments respond to fulfill the gaps, to fulfill the aspirations, to address the unmet need. Measures were also taken by the governments to ensure land, housing, services and livelihood in the less developed regions. Concrete measures to improve living conditions of the urban poor were particularly lacking in countries with higher proportion of slum dwellers and faster pace of urbanization. We have several examples from many developing countries like Dhaka, many cities in India, Manila and other places where we have lack of concrete measures to improve living conditions of the urban poor. Now, let us summarize the learnings of this module so far. We discussed about the spatial distribution and the linkages between spatial distribution and urbanization. We also discussed about the policies that were in place, the concerns that were expressed by the governments in more developed as well as less developed regions, besides the least developed countries, in response to the spatial distribution. By and large, the governments were in favor of bringing in changes in the spatial distribution of the country. This is a positive sign in view of uneven distribution of the population. We also have looked at the policy response towards reducing rural to urban migration in view of the issues that are associated with rural to urban migration. We also have seen the kind of response to urbanization from the various governments, and in view of the expected growth in urban population as well as urban agglomerations, particularly in Africa and Asia, perhaps there is need for greater focus towards urbanization and rural urban migration besides spatial distribution in these continents. The governments in many of the developing countries have started recognizing the importance of spatial distribution and urbanization, and they also have initiated policy measures to address the issues relating to urbanization and spatial distribution, besides addressing the issues relating to rural urban migration in terms of providing infrastructure, facilities and services in the rural areas. Like our late President Dr. Kalam mentioned, need of the hour is Pura. What he meant by Pura is providing urban infrastructure in rural areas. If urban infrastructure is provided in the rural areas, one can prevent rural to urban migration. As a result of that, we can have low levels of urbanization. That means less crowding in the urban areas. That means we will not have the issues relating to overcrowding and slums and other issues that are consequences of unplanned growth of urban cities and urban agglomerations. In view of this, we got better understanding about the various issues relating to spatial distribution and urbanization and the policy response from the governments to address the issues that are coming out as a result of spatial distribution and urbanization. This module has helped us to get a fair understanding about all the aspects relating to spatial distribution and urbanization. Thank you so much.